I improved your guys' deco to show 3 crucial skills for creating, and they're so simple you can literally use them today, starting with object stacking. Take a look at this block sent in by a viewer. It's not bad, but it could be made far more interesting, and I'll use object stacking to get there. Imagine this block as being made of visual layers, where certain details exist in certain layers. I don't mean editor or Z layers, by the way, just different sections of the block. Right now this block has 2 layers or major sections, one which has all the pipes, and a second one for the stone on the inside. I'm going to add a few more layers, starting by putting 1 layer of deco inside the block and above the pipes. I'll then split the remaining areas using these smaller pipes, which I darkened and layered under the large pipes to differentiate them. The thing about visual layers like these is they don't exist in a vacuum. Layers need to interact for you to know where they are, and if they don't, you can't tell which layers are above or below others. For example, you can't tell if this sign in the block is above the pipes or not, because while it's clearly on top of the stone, it doesn't interact with the pipes at all. You can make layers interact by having them touch and overlap, which is how you know the pipes go above the stone. The stone details are covered up by the pipes, to put it simply. With my changes, I added some more stacking between the layers, making them interact more. The inside pipe on the left goes below the large pipes and the inside section, while the one on the right starts above the inside section and ends underneath the other pipes. I would make this more obvious by shrinking the pipe closer to the right side, but it's fine for now. Now, to actually stack objects, you do need to use Z layers. Objects with higher Z layers and Z order numbers appear above objects with lower ones. You don't technically need to do this. You could carefully make each shape so they don't overlap while using the same layers, but it's much faster to just use layering to stack your objects. The main thing to remember is that when stacking objects for deco, Z layers are kinda relative. If you put an object on B3, it'll get covered by one on B2 or T3 all the same. But if you put more Z layers in between those objects, you can make far more use of stacking than you could otherwise. One way to effectively use stacking is with details. The original creator already did this here, as the pipes are made by taking basic circles and rectangles, stacking glow objects on top of those, and then stacking more rectangles on top to make the pipe sections. Even though this stacking occurs within the same section of the block, it does make it more interesting to look at. I also did something similar with the inside section, where I made this highlight by copy-pasting the objects, scaling them down, and darkening the copy. It's also how you know the lights and sign are on different layers, since they're stacked on top of the base details in the block. Another benefit of stacking is how interesting your shapes can be. Before adding this middle section, the block had both of these shapes on the inside, which aren't really that interesting on their own. After making the changes though, you get these 4 sections, each with far more interesting shapes than before. Making this change also gives me more freedom to move the details around. Instead of having only 2 areas the sign and lights could go in, I can choose between 5 sections instead. However, stacking alone can't save your deco. It changes the shapes you're using in your objects, but it won't make your colors good on its own. However, it can help your colors if you use it properly with blending and opacity. Here's a second block for this video, and it already makes good use of object stacking from a glance, though the colors could be a bit better. I'll add a few sections to it and make use of some overlapping, but those won't be the main changes I make. The thing is, while this block uses object stacking well, it could be so much better if it used the properties of opacity and blending. If you don't know what those do, opacity makes your objects see-through, while blending also does that, but it adds colors together. When you stack objects with opacity or blending, the area where the objects overlap will have a different color from the original objects. This can be annoying since these intersections are really easy to notice and can make your deco look super messy. However, we can also use it to our advantage, like here. My first change is selecting the brighter glow and to make it smaller. Since glow objects are like gradients, when you stack them on each other and change their size, you can make more interesting gradients that way. When combined with blending, these new gradients can cycle through lots of colors and look far more vibrant. This is even more useful with a technique known as hue shifting, where you take the larger, darker glow and give it a slightly different hue than the brighter or smaller glow. I use this technique on the glow here and on many of the details that use glow in general. For those, I also make sure the actual details are bright and less saturated compared to the glow, so they won't look like a total mess. And once these changes are made, I just have to tweak the colors so everything else looks nice. You can use the same tools with opacity as well. One way people do this is to create textures, since combining objects with different textures lets you make new ones. This works really well with partial masking, where you take an object with 2 color channels and make one of them invisible. The circles and crosses in this block were made using the partial mask technique. You can also stack objects with opacity and slightly change their positions to create blur. These techniques are used constantly by the best creators in the game, since there are so many benefits of knowing them. Another benefit of stacking objects with blending and opacity is just making your deco more clear. This type of stacking requires you to get good with colors if you want to use it effectively, like making sure your glow isn't a total mess. You'll notice that my biggest change to this block was making the colors more clear. Beforehand, the block had really similar colors throughout it and looks kinda muddy and unclear, but now the top section is bright and obvious as it's what players will interact with. The outside area is also brighter so you can see the details, and the inside is the darkest with the least details since it's not as important. With these changes, the block looks better and more interesting than it did before. But of course, making these changes still requires you to know what objects to use, and there are hundreds of objects in the editor, so it's easy to get lost trying to find the best ones for your deco. Ultimately, it all comes down to shapes again. If you watched the last video, you should know how to make any shape by combining basic objects like squares, triangles, lines, and circles. The same idea applies when choosing objects in the editor. You can view these objects as combinations of basic shapes, and search for specific objects in the editor with that in mind. As always, you can use reference images to help you search faster, since they give ideas for what shapes to use, and tools like scaling and warping to make the objects fit your specific needs. However, choosing objects like this still isn't perfect. Again, there are still hundreds of objects in the editor you could possibly use. Many of them do the same thing too, like each of these square objects which can all be used for the same purpose. If I wanted to make a cross, I could use 2 square objects, or one of these deco objects with a partial mask, or even particle objects. There isn't much you can do about this though. You can learn unique ways to use objects if you copy other people's levels and analyze how they used objects, which is really useful when you're starting out, but you'll have to make lots of levels to really cement those lessons in your head. The best way to improve your object choices is to just create more deco and gain experience. The other issue, however, is tile sets. Every object has a tile set number which you can see above the Z layer buttons. Objects with higher tileset numbers will always render below ones with lower numbers as long as they're on the same Z layer. The problem is you can't change this number. If you want a high tileset object to show above one with a lower tileset number, you have to move its Z layer up by 1, which is really limiting. All sorts of objects have different tileset numbers and it's really inconsistent. Most static objects with hitboxes are on 0, particles are on 8, animated objects on 4, and so on. It makes mixing these objects really difficult and limiting to do. At the same time, improving your object choices still has serious benefits, as you can see with this third level. This user asked me to improve the level's textures, which is something I can easily do by improving the object choices. Take this wood wall for example. Originally, this would all use the same object, which worked but wasn't the most optimized or interesting. So I added these objects which looked like wood panels and copy-pasted them in a way that looked random enough. This object choice was, again, something I did partly out of experience, but I also searched up some reference images for what wood walls look like. I also used warping to save objects at many points, like stretching out some of these objects that had repetitive textures. After tweaking the colors a bit, I still wanted to have a bit more variety in the wood while maintaining the smooth look it originally had, so I took these objects and stretched them out until they looked more like wood grain. This choice was, again, one I made after looking at reference images. I then stacked them on top of the existing wood objects and re-added the glow that was there before as well, making sure to warp it so I could save objects. After that, it was just making a few color and layering changes to finish off the improvements. This modified version has many improvements over the original. For one, changing up the object used gives it more variety, which looks more interesting than it did before. In addition, it gave more chances to use things like scaling and warping to save objects, which actually saved almost 100 objects in total here. Good object choices don't just make the building process faster for you, they also save lots of time you'd otherwise spend trying to optimize a level and prevent lag. No matter what you do when decorating, choosing good objects is the most important skill for Geometry Dash. Now, to be fair, all of these skills require practice if you want to really improve. Fortunately, we already have tons of practice exercises you can use, and all you have to do is join our Discord server and get the guided access role to start practicing.